Men in society. At a certain age, children are greatly intrigued by the possibility of locating themselves on a map. It appears strange that one's familiar life should actually have all occurred in an area delineated by a set of quite impersonal and hitherto unfamiliar coordinates on the surface of the map. The child's exclamation of "I was there" and "I am here right now" betray the astonishment that the place of last summer's vacation, a place marked in memory by such sharply personal events as the ownership of one's first dog, or the secret assembling of a collection of worms, should have specific latitudes and longitudes devised by strangers to one's dog, one's worms, and oneself. This locating of oneself is configuration conceived by strangers is one of the important aspects of what, perhaps euphemistically, is called growing up. One participates in the real world of grown-ups by having an address. The child, who one recently might have made a letter addressed to my granddaddy, now informs a fellow worm collector of his exact address, street, town, state and all, and finds his tentative allegiance to the ground-up worldview dramatically legitimated by the arrival of the latter. As the child continues to accept the reality of this worldview, he continues to gather addresses. I'm 6 years old. I'm 6 years old. I am 6 years old. My name is Brown, like my father's. That's because my parents are divorced. I am a Presbyterian. I am an American, and eventually, perhaps, I am in the special class for the bright kids. That because my IQ is 130. The horizons of the world, as the grown-ups define it, are determined by the coordinates of remote map makers. The child may produce alternate identifications by having himself addressed as father while playing house, as Indian chief, or, or as Daddy Crockett, but he will know all the time that he is only playing, that the real facts about himself are those registered by those school authorities. We leave out the quotation marks and thus betray that we too have been trapped into sanity in our childhood. Of course, we will write all the key words in quotation marks. Now, read now, real facts. The same child is the one who believes in what it says in the school records. The normal adult is one. The normal adult is the one who lives within his assigned coordinates. What is called the common sense view is actually the grown-up view taken for granted. It's a matter of the identity. A matter of the school records having become an ontology. One now identifies one's being as a matter of course with the way one is pinpointed on the social map. What this means for one's identity and one's ideas will be pursued further in the next chapter. What interests us at the moment is the way in which such location tells an individual just he may do and what he can expect of life. To be located in society means to be at the intersection point of specific social forces. Commonly, one ignores these forces at one's peril. One moves within society within carefully defined systems of power and prestige, and once one knows how to locate oneself, one also knows that there is not an awful lot that one can do about this. The way in which lower class individuals use the pronouns they and them nicely express this consciousness of the heteronomy of one's life. They have things fixed in a certain way. They call the tune. They make the rule. They make the rules. This concept of them may not be too easily identified with particular individuals or groups. It is the system. It is the system. The map made by strangers over which one must keep crawling. But it would be a one-sided way of looking at the system if one assumes that this concept loses its meaning as one moves into the higher levels of society. To be sure, there will be a greater sense of freedom of movement and decision, and realistically so. But the basic coordinates within which one can move and decide have still been drawn by the others, most of them strangers, many of them long in their graves. Even the total autocrat exercise this tyranny against constant resistance, not necessarily political resistance, but the resistance of custom, convention, and sheer habit. Institutions carry within them a principle of inertia, perhaps bounded ultimately on the hard rock of human stupidity. The tyrant finds that even if nobody dares act against him, his orders will, will still be nullified again and again by simple lack of comprehension. The alien-made fabric of society dis- uh, sets itself even against terror. But let us leave the question of tyranny on the levels occupied by most men, including the writer, and we dare say almost all the readers of these lines. Location in society constitutes a definition of size that have been obeyed. As we have seen, the common sense view of society understands this. The sociologist does not contradict this understanding. He sharpens it, analyzes its roots, sometimes either modifies or extends it. We shall see later that the sociological perspective finally goes beyond the common sense understanding of the system and our captivity in it. But in more specific social situations that the sociologist sets out to analyze, he will find little reason to quarrel with the notion that they are in charge. On the contrary, they, they will loom larger in more perceptive passion over our lives than we thought before the sociological analysis. This aspect of sociological perspective can be clarified by looking at two important areas of investigation: social control and social stratification. Social Social control is one of the most generally used concepts in sociology. It refers to the various means used by a society in, in being its recalcitrant members back into line. No society can exist without social control. Even a small group of people meeting but occasionally will have to develop their mechanisms of control if the group is not dissolved in very short time. It goes without saying that the instrumentalities of social control vary greatly from one social situation to another. Opposition to the line in a business organization may mean what personal directors call a terminal interview, and in a criminal syndicate, a terminal automobile ride. Methods of control vary with the purpose and character of the group in question. In either case, control mechanisms function to eliminate undesirable personnel, and as it was put classically by King Christoph of Haiti when he had every 10 men in his Fox Labor battalion executed to encourage the others. The ultimate and, no doubt, the oldest means of social control in physical violence. In the savage society of children, it is still the major one. But even in the politely operated societies of modern democracies, the ultimate argument is violence. No state can exist without a police force or its equivalent in armed might. This ultimate violence may not be used frequently. There may be innumerable steps before its application in the way of warnings and reprimands. But if all the warnings are disregarded, even in so slight a matter as paying a traffic ticket, the last thing that will happen is that a couple of cops showed up at the door with the handcuff and a Black Maria. Even the moderately courteous cop with who hands out the initial traffic ticket is likely to wear a gun just in case. And even in England, when he does not in the normal course of events, he will be issued one. He will be issued one if the need arises. In Western democracies, with their ideological emphasis on voluntary compliance with popularly legislated rules, this constant presence of official violence is underemphasized. It is all the more important to be aware of it. Violence is the ultimate foundation of any political order. The common sense view of society senses this, and this may have something to do with the widespread popular reluctance to eliminate capital punishment from the criminal law. Though, the, though this reluctance is probably based in a cruel measure on stupidity, superstition, and the congenital bestiality the juries share with the bulk of their fellow citizens. However, the statement that political order rests ultimately on violence is just as true in states that have abolished capital punishment. Under certain circumstances, the use of the weapons is permitted to state troopers in Connecticut where, much to their freely expressed gratification, an electric chair graces the central penal establishment, but the same possibility exists for the college in Rhode Island, where, where, where police and prison authorities have to get along without this facility. It goes without saying that in countries with less of a democratic and humanitarian ideology, the instruments of violence are much less gingerly displayed and employed. Since the constant use of violence would be impractical and also ineffective, the official organs of social control rely mostly on the restraining influence of the generally known as availability of the means of violence. For various reasons, this reliance is usually justified in any society that is not on the brink of catastrophic dissolution, as say in situations of revolution, military defeat or natural disaster. The most important reason for this is the fact that even in dictatorial and terroristic states, a regime tends to gain acceptance and even acceptability by the simple passage of time. This is not the place to go into the physiological dynamics of this fact. In democratic societies, there is at least at the there is at least the tendency for most people to share the values of on behalf of which the means of violence are employed. This does not mean does not mean that the values have to be fine. The majority of the white people in some certain communities may be, for instance, in favor of using violence ad- as administered by the police agencies in order to uphold segregation, but it does not mean that the employment of the means of violence is approved by bulk of the populace. In any function in any functioning society, violence is used economically and as a last resort, with the mere threat of this ultimate violence sufficing for the day-to-day exercise of social control. For our purposes in this argument, the most important matter to underline is that nearly all men live in social situations in which, if all other means of coercion fail, violence may be officially and legally used against them. If the role of violence in social control is thus understood, it becomes clear that the, so to speak, penu- penultimate means of coercion are more important for more people most of the time. While there is a certain uninspired sameness about the methods of intimidation taught up by jurists and policemen, the less than violent instrumentalities of social control show good verity and sometimes imagination. Next in line after the political and legal controls, one should probably place economic pressure. Few means of coercion are as effective as those that threaten one's livelihood or profit. Both management and labor effectively use this treatment as an instrumentality of control in our society. But economic means of control are just as effective outside the institutions properly called the economy. Universities or churches use economic sanctions just as effectively in restraining their personnel from engaging in deviant behavior deemed by the respective authorities to go beyond the limits of the acceptable. It may not be actually illegal for a minister to seduce his organism, but the threat of being barred forever from the exercise of his profession will be a much more effective control over this temptation than the possible threat of going to jail. It is undoubtedly not illegal for a minister to speak his mind on issues that the ecclesiastical bureaucracy would have rather buried in silence, but the chance of spending the rest of his life in minimally paid rural parishes is a very powerful argument indeed. Naturally, such arguments are employed more openly in economic institutions proper, but the mission of economic sanctions in churches or universities is not very different in its end results for that used in the business world, where human beings live or work in compact groups in which they are personally known and to which we are tied by feeling of personal loyalty. The kind of sociologists call primary groups very potent and simultaneously very subtle mechanisms of control are constantly brought to bear upon the actual or potential defiant. These are the mechanisms of persuasion, ridicule, gossip, and opprobrium. It has been discovered that in group discussions going on over a period of time, individuals modify their originally held opinions to conform to the group norm, which corresponds to a kind of arithmetic mean of all the opinion represented in the group. Where this norm lies obviously depends on the constituency of the group. For example, if you have a group of 20 cannibals going over cannibalism with one non-cannibal, the chances are that in the end he will come to see the point and with just a few face-saving reservations concerning, say, the consumptions of close relatives, will go over completely to the majority's point of view. But if you have a group discussion between 10 cannibals who regard human flesh aged over 60 years as too tough for a cultivated palate, and 10 other cannibals who fastidiously draw the line at 50, the chances are that the group will eventually agree on 55 as the age that divides the degenerate from the debris when it comes to sorting out prisoners. Such are the wonders of group dynamics. What lies at the bottom of this apparently inevitable pressure towards consensus is probably a profound human desire to be accepted, presumably by whatever group is around to do the accepting. This desire can be manipulated most effectively, as is well known by group therapists, dem- demagogues, and other specialists in the field of consensus engineering. Ridicule and gossip are potent or are potent instruments of social control in primary groups of all sorts. Many societies use ridicule as one of the main controls over children, as the child conforms not for fear or punishment, but in order not to be laughed at. But in order not to be laughed at. Within our larger culture, kidding in this way has been an important disciplinary measure among certain Negroes. But most men have experienced the freezing fear of making oneself ridiculous in some special situation. Gossip, as hardly needs elaboration, is especially effective in small communities where most people lives live their lives in a high degrees of social visibility and inspectability by their neighbors. In such communities, gossip is one of the principal channels of communication, essential for the maintenance of the social fabric. But ridicule and gossip can be manipulated deliberately by any intelligent person with access to the lines of transmission. Finally, one of the most devastating means of punishment at the disposal of human community is to subject one of these members to systematic opprobrium and ostracism. It is somewhat ironic to reflect that this is a favorite control mechanism with groups opposed on principle to the use of violence. An example of this would an example of this would be shunning among the Amish Mennonites. An individual who breaks one of the principal taboos of the group, for example, getting sexually involved with an outsider, is shot. This means that while permitted to continue to work and live in the community, not a single person will speak to him ever. It is hard to imagine a more cruel punishment, but such are the wonders of pacifism. One aspect of social control that ought to be stressed is the fact that it is frequently based on fraudulency claims. Later, we shall take up further the general importance of fraud in a sociological understanding of human life. Here, Here we will simply stress that a conception of social control is incomplete and thus misleading unless this element is taken into account. A little boy can exercise considerable control over his peer group by having a big brother who, if need be, can be called upon to beat up any opponents. In the absence of such a brother, however, it is possible to invent one. It will then be a question of the public relations talents of the little boy as to whether he will succeed in translating his invention into actual control. In any case, this is definitely possible. The same possibilities of fraudulence are present in all the forms of social control discussed. This is why intelligence has some survival value in the competition with brutality, malice, and material resources. We shall return to this point later. It is possible then to perceive oneself as standing at the center, that is, at the point of maximum pressure of a set of concentric cycles, is representing a system of social control. The other ring might well represent the legal and political system under which one is obligated to live. This is the system that, quite against one's will tax one, draft one into the military, make one obey its innumerable rules and regulations, if need to be put in prison, and in the last resort will kill one. One does not have to be right-wing Republican to be perturbed by the ever increasing expansion of this system's power into every conceivable aspect of one's life. A salutary exercise will be to note down for the span of a single week of all the occasions, including fiscal ones, in which came up against the demands of the political legal system. The exercise can be concluded by adding up the sum total of fines and or terms of imprisonment that disobedience to the system might lead to. The consolation incidentally with which one might recover from this exercise will consist of the recollection that law enforcement agencies are normally corrupt and of only limited efficiency. Another system of social control that exerts its pressures towards the solitary figures in the center is that of morality, customs, and manners. Only the most urgent seeming to the authorities that is aspect of the system are endowed with legal sanctions. This does not mean, however, that one can safely be immoral, eccentric, and unmannered. At this point, all the other instrumentalities of social control go into action. Immorality is punished by loss of one's job, eccentricity by the loss of one's chances of finding a new one, bad manners by remaining uninvited and uninvitable in the groups that respect what they consider good manners. Unemployment and loneliness may be minor penalties compared to being dragged away by the cops, but they may not actually appear so to the individuals thus punished. Extreme defiance against the mores of one particular society, which is quite sophisticated in its control apparatus, may lead to yet another consequence, that of being defined by common consent as sick. And enlightened bureaucratic management, such as, for example, the ecclesiastical authorities of some Protestant denominations, no longer trust its defiant employees out out of the state, but instead encompass them to undergo treatment by its consulting psychiatrist. In this way, the defiant individual, that is, the one who does not meet the criteria of normality set by management or by his bishop, is still threatened with unemployment and with the loss of his social ties. But in addition, he is also stigmatized as one who might very well fall outside the pale of responsible men altogether, unless he can give evidence of remorse, insight, and resignation response to the treatment. Thus, innumerable counseling, guidance, and therapy programs developed in any sector of contemporary institutional life greatly strengthen the control apparatus of the society as a whole, and especially those parts of it where the sanction of the political legal system cannot be invoked. But in addition to these both cohesive systems that every individual shares with vast numbers of fellow controllers, there are other and less extensive cycles of control to which he is subjected. His choice as an occupation, or often more accurately, the occupation in which he happens to end up, inevitably subordinates the individual to a variety of controls, often stringent ones. There are the formal controls of licensing boards, professional organizations, and trade unions, in addition, of course, to the formal requirements set by his particular employers. Equally important are the informal controls imposed by colleagues and co-workers. Again, it is it is hardly necessary to elaborate overly on this point. The reader can construct his own example. The physicians the physician who participates in a prepaid comprehensive health insurance program, the undertaker who advertises in expensive funerals, the engineer in industry who does allow for plan of lengths in his calculations, the minister who says that he is not interested in the size of the membership of his church, or rather the one who acts accordingly. They nearly all say so. The government bureaucrat who consistently spends less than his allotted budget, the assembly line worker who exceeds the norms regarded as acceptable his colleagues, and so on. Economic sanctions are, of course, the most frequent and effective ones. In this instance, the physician finds himself back from all available hospitals. The undertaker may be expelled from his or professional organization for unethical conduct. The engineer may have to volunteer for the Peace Corps, as may the minister and the bureaucrat in, say, New Guinea, where there is as yet no plain obsolescence, where Christians are few and far between, and where the governmental machinery is small enough to be relatively rational, and the assembly line worker may find that all the defective parts of machinery in the entire plant have a way of congregating on his workbench. But the sanctions, but the sanctions of social exclusion, contempt, and ridicule may be almost as hard to bear. Its occupational role in society, even in every humble jobs, carries with it a code of conduct that is very hard indeed to defy. Adherence to this code is normally just as essential for one's career in the occupation as a technical competence or training. The social control of one's occupational system is so important because the job decides what one may do in most of the rest of one's life, which voluntary associations one will be allowed to join, who will be one's friends, where one will be able to live. However, quite apart from the pressures of one's occupation, one's other social involvements also entail control systems, many of them less unbending than the occupational one, but some even more so. The codes governing admission to and continued membership in any clubs and fraternal organizations are just as strict as those that decide who can become an executive at IBM. Sometimes, luckily for the harassed candidate, the requirements may actually be the same. In less exclusive associations, the rules may be more lax and one may only rarely get drowned out, but life can be so truly unpleasant for the persistence for the persistent non-conformist to the local walkways that continued participation becomes humanly impossible. The items covered by such unwritten codes will, naturally, vary greatly. They may include ways of dressing, language, aesthetic taste, political or religious convictions, or simply table manners. In all these cases, however, they constitute control cycles that effectively circumscribe the range of the individual possible actions in the particular situation.
Finally, the human group in which one's so-called private life occurs, that is, the cycle of one's family and personal friends, also constitutes a control system. It would be a grave error to assume that this is necessarily the weakest of them, all just because it does not possess the formal means of coercion of some of the other control systems. It is in this cycle that an individual normally has his most important social ties. Disapproval, loss of prestige, ridicule, or contempt in this intimate group has far more serious psychological weight than the same reactions encountered elsewhere. It may be economically disastrous if one's boss finally concludes that one is a worthless nobody, but the psychological effect of such a judgment is incomparably more devastating if one discovers that one's wife has arrived at the same conclusion. What's more, the pressures of this most intimate control system can be applied at those times when one is less prepared for them. At one's job, one at one's job, one is usually in a better position to brace oneself, to be on one's guard, and to pretend than one is at home. Contemporary and American familism, a set of values that strongly emphasize the home as a place of refuge for the tensions of the world and of personal fulfillment, contributes effectively to this control system. The man who is at least relatively prepared psychologically to give battle in his office is willing to do almost anything to preserve the precarious harmony of his family life. Last but not least, the social control of what German sociologists have called the sphere of the intimate is particularly powerful because of the very factors that have gone into its construction in the individual's biography. A man chooses a wife and a good friend in acts of essential self-definition. His most intimate relationships are those that he must count upon to sustain the most important elements of his self-image. To risk, therefore, the disintegration of these relationships means to risk losing his to risk losing himself in a total way. It is no wonder then that it is no wonder then that many an office despot promptly obeys his wife and clings before the raised eyebrow of his friends. If we return once more to the picture of one individual located at the center of a set of concentric cycles, each one representing a system of social control, we can understand a little better that location in society means to locate oneself with regard to many forces that constrain and coerce one. The individual who, thinking consequently of all the people he is in in a position to have to please, from the collector of internal revenue to his mother-in-law, gets the idea that all of society sits right uh, on top of him, had better not dismiss that idea as a momentary neurotic derangement. The sociologist, at any rate, is likely to strengthen him in this conception, no matter what other counselors may tell him to snap out of it. Another important area of sociological analysis that may serve to explicate the full meaning of location in society is that of social stratification. The concept of stratification refers to the fact that any society will consist of levels that relate to each other in terms of superordination and subordination, but be it in power, privilege, or prestige. To say this more simply, stratification means that every society has a system of ranking. Some strata rank higher, some lower. Their sum constitutes the stratification system of that particular society. Stratification theory is one of the most complex sectors of sociological thought that, and it would be quite outside the present context to give any kind of introduction to it. Suffice it to say that societies differ greatly in the criteria by which individuals are assigned to the different levels, and that distinct certification systems, quite using quite different criteria of placement, may coexist in the same society. Clearly, very different factors decide an individual's position in the stratification scheme of traditional Hindu church society from those that determine his position in a modern Western society. And the three principal rewards of social position, power, privilege, and prestige, frequently do not overlap by, but exist side by side in distinct stratification systems. In America, wealth often leads to political power, but not inevitably so. Also, there are powerful individuals with little wealth, and prestige may be connected with activities quite unrelated to economic or political rank. These remarks may serve a cautionary purpose as we proceed to look at the way in which occasion in society involves the certification system with its enormous influence on one's entire life. The most important type of stratification is in contemporary Western society is the class system. The concept of class, as most concepts in stratification theory, has been defined in different ways. For our purpose, it is sufficient to understand class as a type of stratification in which one's general position in society is basically determined by economic criteria.
In such a society, the rank one achieves is typically more important than the one into which one was born, although most people recognize that the latter greatly influences the former. Also, a class society is one in which there is a typical high degree of social mobility. This means that social positions are not immutably fixed, that many people change their positions for better or for worse in the course of their lifetime, and that consequently no position seems quite secure. As a result, the symbolic accoutrements of one's position are of great importance, that is, by the use of various symbols, such as material objects, styles of demeanor, taste, and speech, types of association, and each appropriate opinions. One keeps on, on showing to the world just where one has arrived. This is what sociologists call status symbolism, and it has been an important concern in stratification studies. Max Weber defined class in terms of the expectations in life that an individual may reasonably have. In other words, one's class position yield certainly probabilities of life changes as to the fate one may expect in society. Everyone recognizes that this is so in strictly economic terms. An upper middle class American of, say, 20 years, 25 years of age has a much better chance of owning a suburban home, two cars, and a cottage on the Cape 10 years. Hence, this contemporary occupying a lower middle class position. This does not mean that the latter has no chance at all achieving these things, but simply that he is operating under a statistical handicap. This is hardly surprising since class was defined in economic terms to begin with, and the normal economic process ensures that those who have will those who will have will have more added thereunto. But class determines life changes in ways that go far beyond the economic in its proper sense. One's class position determines the amount of education one's children are likely to receive. It determines the standards of medical care enjoyed by oneself and one's family, and therefore one's expectancy. Life changes in the literal sense of the word. The higher classes in our society are better fed, better housed, better educated, and live longer than their less fortunate fellow citizens. These observations may be truisms, but they gain in impact if one sees that there is a statistical correlation between the quantity of money one earns per annum and the number of years one may expect to do so on this earth. But the importance of location within the class system goes even further than that.
Different classes in our society not only live differently quantitatively, they live in different styles qualitatively. A sociologist would result, if given to basic indices of class such as income and occupation, can make a long list of predictions about the individual in question even if no further information has been given. Like all sociological predictions, these will be statistical in character. That is, they will be probability statements and will have a margin of error. Nevertheless, they can be made with a good deal of assurance. Given these two items of information about a particular individual, the sociologist will be able to make intelligent guesses about the part of town in which the individual lives, as well as about the size and style of his house. He will also be able to give a general description of the interior decorating of the house and make a guess about the types of pictures on the wall and books or magazines likely to be found on the shelves of the living room. Moreover,
He will be able to guess what kind of music the individual in question likes to listen to and whether he does so at concerts, on a phonograph, or on the radio. But the sociologist can go on. He can predict which voluntary associations the individual has joined and where he has his church membership. He can estimate in the individual's vocabulary, lay down some rough rules for his syntax and other use of language. He can guess the individual's political affiliation and his views on a number of public issues. He can predict the number of children cited by his subject and also whether the latter has sexual relations with his wife, with, with the likes on or off. He will be able to make some statements about the likelihood that his subject will come down with a number of diseases, physical as well as mental. As we have seen already, he will be able to place the man on actuary tables and what on the actuary table life expectancies. Finally, if the sociologist should decide to verify all these guesses and ask the individual in question for an interview, he can estimate the chance that the interview will be refused. Many of the elements just touched upon are enforced by external controls in any given class milieu. Thus, the corporation executive who has the wrong address and the wrong wife will be subjected to considerable pressures to change both. The working class individual who wants to join an upper middle class church will be made to understand in unmistakable terms that he go be happier elsewhere, or the lower middle class child with a taste for chamber music will come up against strong pressures to change this aberration to musical interest more in accord with those of his family and friends. However, in many of these cases, the application of external controls is quite unnecessary because the likelihood that deviance will occur is very small indeed. Most individuals to whom an executive career is open marry the right kind of wife, the one that David Richman has called the station wagon type, almost by instinct, and most lower middle class children have their musical tastes forms for, test, tastes form early in such a way that they are relatively immune to the blandishments of chamber music. Each class milieu forms the personality of its constituency of innumerable influences, beginning at birth and leading up the graduation from prep school or reformatory, as the case may be. Only when these formative influences have somehow failed to achieve their objective is it necessary for the mechanism of social control to go into action. In trying to understand the way of class, then, we are not only looking at another aspect of social control, but are beginning to catch a glimpse of the way in which society penetrates inside of our consciousness, something that we shall discuss further in the next chapter. It should be emphasized that at this point, that these observations on class are in no way intended as an indignant indictment of our society. There are certainly there are certainly some aspects of class differences that could be modified by certain kinds of social engineering, such as discrimination in education and class inequalities in medical care. But no amount of social engineering will change the basic fact that different social milieus exert different pressures on their constituencies, or that some of these pressures are more conducive than others towards success, as success may be defined in that particular society. There is good reason to believe that some of the fundamental characteristics of a class system, as just touched upon, are to be found in all industrial or industrializing societies, including those operating under socialistic regimes that deny the existence of class in their official ideology. But if location in one social stratum as against another has their far-reaching consequences in a society as relatively open as ours, it can easily be seen what the consequences are in more closed system. In more closed systems, we we tailor here once more to Daniel Lerner's instructive analysis of the traditional societies of the Middle East, in which a social location fixed one's identity and one's expectations, even the imagination, to a degree that most Westerners today find hard to find hard even to grasp. Yet European societies before the Industrial Revolution were not too distinctly different in most of their strata for Lerner's traditional model. In such societies, a man's total being can be gleaned from one look at his social position, as one can glance at a Hindu's forehead and see on it the mark of his caste. However, even if even in our own society, superimposed as it were on the class system, there are other stratification systems that are far more rigid and therefore far more determinative of an individual entire life than that of caste. In American society, a notable example of this is the racial system, which most sociologists regard as a variety of caste. In such a system, an individual's basic social position, that is, adjustment to his caste group, is fixed at birth. At least in the theory, there is no possibility at all for him to change the position in the course of lifetime. A man may become as rich as he wants to, he will still be a Negro, or a man may sing as low as it is possible to sing in terms of the marks of society, he will still be white. An individual is born in his chest, must live all his life within it and within all the limitations of conduct that this entails, and of course he must marry and procreate within the chest. In actuality, at least in our racial system, there are some possibilities of cheating, namely the practice of light-skinned Negroes passing as whites, but this possibility is too little to change the total efficacy of the system. The depressing facts of the American racial system are too well known to necessitate much elaboration here. It is clear that the social location of an individual as a Negro, more so in the South than in the North, of course, but with fewer differences between the two regions than to self-reduce northern whites commonly allow, implies a far narrower channeling of existential possibilities than happens by way of class. Indeed, the individual's possibilities of class mobility are most definitely determined by his racial location, since some of the most stringent disabilities of the latter are economic in character. Thus, a man's conduct, ideas, and psychological identity are shaped by race in a manner far more decisive than they commonly are by class. The constraining force of this location can be seen in its pure system, if such an adjective can be applied even in a quasi-chemical sense to so revolting a phenomenon in the racial etiquette of traditional Southern society, in which every single instance of interaction between members of the two castes was regulated in a stylistic, stylist ritual designed carefully to honor the one party and to humiliate the other. A Negro risks physical punishment, and a white man extreme opprobrium by the slightest deviation from the ritual. Race determined infinitely more than where one could live and with whom could associate. It determined one's linguistic inflection, one's gestures, one's joke, and even penetrate one's dreams and observation. In such a system, The criteria of stratification become metaphysical obsessions, as in the case of the certain gentlewoman who expressed the conviction that her cook was solely born for the fox heavens, for the colored fox heaven. A commonly used concept in sociology is that of the definition of the situation, first coined by the American sociologist W. I. Thomas. It means that a social situation is what it is defined to be by its participants. In other words, for the sociologist's purposes, reality is a matter of definition. This is why the sociologist must analyze the many facets of human conduct that are in themselves absurd or delusional. In the example of the racial system just given, a biologist or physical anthropologist might take one look at the racial beliefs of white Sultans and declare that these beliefs are totally erroneous. He can then dismiss them as but another mythology produced by human ignorance and ill will, pack up his things and go home. The sociologist asks, however, only begins at this point. It does not help at all for him to dismiss the certain racial ideology as a scientific imbecility. Many social situations are effectively controlled by the definitions of imbecilism. Indeed, the imbecility that defines the situation is part of the stuff of sociological analysis. Thus, the sociologist's operational understanding of reality is a somewhat peculiar one, a point to which we shall return again. For the moment, it is merely important to point out the inexorable controls by which social location determines our lives are not done away with by debunking the ideas that undergird these controls. Nor is nor is this the whole story. Our lives are not only dominated by the inanities of our contemporaries, but also by those of men who have been dead for generations. What is more, each inanity gains credence and reference with each decade that passes after its original promulgation. As Alfred Sweats has pointed out, this means that each social situation in which we find ourselves is not only defined by our contemporaries, but predefined by our predecessors. Since I cannot possibly talk back to one's ancestors, their ill-conceived constructions are commonly more difficult to get rid of than those built in our own lifetime. This fact is called by in Fontenelle's aphorism that the dead are more powerful than the living. This is important to stress because it shows us that even in the areas where society apparently allows us some choice, the powerful hand of the past narrows down this choice even further. Let us, for example, return to an incident evoked earlier, a scene in which a pair of lovers are sitting in the moonlight. Let us further imagine that this moonlight session turns out to be decisive one, in which a proposal of marriage is made and accepted. Now, we know the contemporary society impose considerable limitation on such a choice, greatly facilitating it among couples that fit into the same socio-economic categories and putting heavy obstacles in the way of such as do not. But it is equally clear that even where they who are still alive have made no conscious attempts to limit the choice of the participants in this particular drama, they who are dead have long ago written the script for almost every move that is made. The notion of the sexual attraction can be translated into romantic emotion was cooked up by voiced minstrels titillating the imagination of aristocratic ladies about the 12th century of their boats. The idea that
a man should fixate his sexual drive permanently and exclusively on one single woman in whom he is to set bedroom, and the boredom of a thousand barely eyed breakfasts was produced by misanthropic theologians some time before that, and the assumption that the initiative in the establishment of this wondrous arrangement should be in the hands of the male, with the female graciously succumbing to the impetuous onslaught on his wing, goes, goes back right to prehistoric times when savage warriors first descended on some peaceful matriarchal hamlet and dragged away its screaming daughters to their marital courts. Just as all these hoary ancients have decided the basic framework within which the patience of our exemplary couple will develop, so each step in the courtship has been predefined, prefabricated, if you like, fixed. It is not only that they are supposed to fall in love and to enter into a monogamous marriage in which she gives up her name and he be sovereignty, that this love must be manufactured at all costs, or the marriage will seem insincere to all concerned, and that the state and church will watch over the marriage with anxious attention once it is established, all of which are fundamental assumptions concocted centuries before the protagonists were born. Each step in the courtship is laid down in social ritual also, and although there is always some leeway for improvisations, too much delaying is likely to risk the success of the whole operation. In this way, a couple progresses predictably, with what a lawyer would call due deliberate speed, from movie dates to church dates to meeting the family dates, from holding hands to tentative explorations to what they originally planned to save afterward, from planning the evening to planning the suburban ranch house, with the scene in the moonlight put in its property place in the ceremonial sequence. Neither of them has invented this game or any part of it. They have only decided that it is with each other, rather than with other possible partners, that they will play it. Nor do they have an awful lot of choice as to what is to happen after the necessary ritual exchange of question and answer. Family, friends, clergy, salesmen of jewelry and of life insurance, florists, and interior decorators ensure that the remainder of the game will also be played by the established rules. Nor indeed do all these guardians of tradition have to exert much pressure on the principal players, since the expectations of the world have have long ago been built into their own projections of the future. They want precisely that which society expects of them. If this is so, in the most intimate concern of our existence, it is easy to see that it is the same almost it is the same in almost any social situation encountered in the course of a lifetime. Most of the time the game has been fixed long before we arrive in the scene. All that is left for us to do, most of the time, it is to play it with more or with less enthusiasm. The professor stepping in front of his class, the judge pronouncing sentence, the preacher badgering his congregation, the commander ordering his troops into battle, all these are engaged in actions that have been predefined within very narrow limits, and impressive systems of controls and sanctions tends guard over these limits. With this consideration behind us, we cannot arrive at a more sophisticated understanding of the functioning of social structures. A useful sociological concept on which to base the understanding is that of institution. An institution is commonly defined as distinctive complex of social actions. Thus, we can speak of the law, class, marriage, of or organized relation as constituting institutions. Such as such a definition does not yet tell us in what way the institution relates to the actions of the individuals involved. A suggestive answer to this question has been given by Arno Gehlen, a contemporary German social scientist. Gehlen conceives of an institution of a regulatory agency channeling human actions in much the same way as instincts channel animal behavior. In other words, institutions provide procedures through which human conduct is patterned, compelled to go in groups desirable by society, and this trick is performed by making these groups appear to the individual as the only possible ones. Let us take an example. Since cats do not have to be taught to chase mice, there is apparently something in a cat's congenital equipment, an instinct, if you like the term, that makes it do so. Presumably, when a cat sees a mouse, there is something in the cat that keeps insisting it, it, it. The cat does not exactly choose to obey this inner voice. It simply follows the law of its innermost being and takes off after helpless mouse, which we suppose has an inner voice that keeps repeating run, 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 like Luther, that the cat can do no other. But now, but now, let us switch back to the couple whose courtship we have previously discussed with such an apparent lack of sympathy. When our young man first beheld the girl destined to perform the moonlight act, or if not at first, for some time afterward, he also found himself listening to an inner voice uttering a clear imperative, and his subsequent behavior shows that he also found that imperative irresistible. No, this imperative is not what the reader probably just thought of. That imperative our young man shares congenitally with young tomcats, chimpanzees, and crocodiles, and it does not interest us at the moment. The imperative that concerns us is the one that says to him, marry, marry, marry. For this imperative, unlike the other, our young man was not born with. It was instilled in him by society, reinforced by the countless pressures of family love, moral education, religion, and the mass media and advertising. In other words, marriage is not an instinct to be an institution. Yet the way it leads behavior into predetermined channels is very similar to what the instincts do where they hold sway. This becomes obvious if we try to imagine what our young man would do in the absence of the institutional imperative. He could, of course, do an almost infinite number of things. He could have sexual relations with the girl, leave and never see her again, or he could wait until her first child is born and then ask her maternal uncle to raise it, or he could get together with three buddies of his and ask them whether they would jointly acquire the girl as their common wife, or he could incorporate her in his harem, all along with the 23 females already living in it. In, un- in other words, given his sex drive and his interest in that particular girl, he would be in quite a quandary. Even assuming that he has studied anthropology and knows that
all the above-mentioned options are the normal thing to do in some human culture, he would still have a difficult time deciding which one would be the most desirable one to follow in this case. Now, we can see what the institutional imperative does for him. It protects him from this quandary. It shuts out all other options in favor of the one that his society has predefined for him. It even bars these other options for his consciousness. It presents him with a formula: to desire is to love is to marry. All that he must do, all that he must do now is to retrace the steps prepared for him in the program. This may have enough difficulties in its own, but the difficulties are of a very different order for those faced by some proto-male coming up against a proto-female in a clearing of the primeval jungle and having to work out a modus vivendi with her. In other words, the situation of marriage serves to channel our young man's conduct to make him behave according to type. The institutional structure of society supplies the typology for our actions. Only very, very rarely are we in a position to think up the new types or to pattern ourselves after. Mostly, we have a maximum choice between type A and type B. Both types were defined for us a priori. Thus, we might decide to be an artist rather than a businessman. But in either case, we shall come up against quite precise predefinitions of the things we must now do. We must now do, and neither way of life will have been invented by ourselves. One further aspect of Gehlen's concept of the institution to stress, because it will be significant later on in our argument, is the seeming inevitability of its imperatives. The fairest young man in our society not only rejects the opinion of polyandry or polygyny, but at least for himself finds them literally unthinkable. He believes that the, the institutionally predefined course of action is the only one he could possibly take, the only one he is ontologically capable of. Presumably the cat, if it reflected on its persecution of the mouse, would arrive at the same conclusion. The difference is that the cat would be right in its conclusion, while the young man is wrong. As far as we know, a cat that refused to chase mice would be a biological monstrosity, perhaps the result of malignant mutation, certainly a traitor to the very essence of femininity. But we know very well that having many wives or being one of many husbands is not a betrayal of humanity in any biological sense or even of virility. And since it's biologically possible for Arabs to have the one and for Tibetans to be the other, it must also be biologically possible for our young men. Indeed, we know that if the latter had been snatched out of his cradle and shipped to the right alliance source at an early enough age, he would not have grown up to be red-blooded and more than slightly sentimental all-American boy of our moonlight scene, but would have developed in a lusty polygamist in Arabia or a contented multiple husband in Tibet. That is, he is deceiving himself, or more accurately, being deceived by society when he looks upon his course of action in the matter as inevitable. This means that every institutional structure must depend on deception, and also its existence in society carries with it an element of bad faith. This glimmering insight may appear truly depressing at first, but as we shall see,
It actually offers us the first glimpse of a view of society somewhat less deterministic than we have obtained so far. For the moment, however, our considerations of sociological perspective have led us to a point where society looks more like a gigantic Alcatraz than anything, than anything, than anything else. We have passed from the childish satisfaction at having an address to the ground-up realization that most of the mail is unpleasant, and sociological understanding has only helped us to identify more closely all the dead personages, dead or alive, who have the privilege of sitting on top of us. The approach of sociology that comes closest to expressing the sort of a view of sociology is the approach associated with Emile Durkheim and his school. Durkheim emphasizes that society is a phenomenon sui generis, that is, it confronts us with a mass reality that cannot be reduced to or to translate it into other terms. He then stated that social facts are things having an objective existence outside of ourselves, just like the phenomena of nature. He did this mainly to protect sociology from being swallowed by the imperial, imperialistically minded psychologists, but his conception is significant beyond this methodological concern. A thing is something like a rock, for example, that one comes up against, that one cannot move by wishing it out of existence or imagining it as having a different shape. A thing, a thing is that against which one can throw oneself in vain, that which is the against all one's desires and hopes, that which can finally fall on one's head and kill one. This is the sense in which society is a collection of things. The law, perhaps more clearly than any other social institution, illustrates this quality of society. If we follow the Durkheimian conception, then society confronts us as an objective facticity. If there is, it is there, something that cannot be denied and that must be reckoned with. Society is external to ourselves. It surrounds us, encompasses our life on all sides. We are in society, located in specific sectors of the social system. This location predetermines and predefines almost everything we do, from language to etiquette, from the religious beliefs we hold to probability that we will commit suicide. Our wishes are not taken into consideration in this manner of social location, and our intellectual resistance to what society prescribes or proscribes avails very little at best and frequently nothing. Society, as objective and external fact, confronts us, especially in the front of coercion. Its institution, its institutions pattern our actions and even shape our expectations. They reward us to the extent that we stay within our assigned performance. If we step out of the assignments, society has at its disposal an almost infinite variety of controlling and coercing agencies. The sanctions of society are able, at each moment of existence, to isolate us among our fellow men, to subject us to ridicule, to deprive us of our sustenance and our liberty, and in the last resort to deprive us of life itself. The law and the moral society can produce elaborate justifications for each one of these sanctions, and most of our fellow men will approve if they are used against us in punishment for our defiance. Finally, we are located in society not only in space but in time. Our society in an historical entity that extends temporally beyond an individual biography. Society attends us, and it will survive us. It was there before we won, and it will be there after we are dead. Our lives are but episodes in its majestic march through time. In sum,
Society is the walls of our imprisonment in history.